Imagine for a moment the sheer scale of $135 billion.
Yeah, it's an incomprehensible number.
It really is. I mean, that is not a rounding error on a spreadsheet. That is the amount of taxpayer money estimated to have been looted, literally looted, in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
Now, you add $22 billion in fraudulent small business loans and another $6.3 billion in suspected fraudulent government contracts to that pile.
It just keeps growing.
Exactly. We are not talking about pennies slipping through the cracks here. We are witnessing an industrial-scale pillaging of the American Treasury by organized syndicates. And to stop this bleeding, we are currently seeing the deployment of the most unprecedented enforcement apparatus in modern American history.
You're talking about the new division, right?
Yes, the newly established National Fraud Enforcement Division and Vice President J.D. Vance's White House Fraud Task Force. I mean, they are aiming to claw back billions, and they are moving with a velocity that has completely shaken the foundations of how the federal government operates.
It's definitely a massive structural shift. But before we dive into the mechanics of this sweeping federal crackdown, please take a moment to like, subscribe, follow, and hit the notification bell. It really helps you stay updated on our rigorous analysis of the policies shaping our world.
And now, a strict legal update regarding ongoing matters. We continue to monitor the Martin Stevens v. OpenAI matter, which is still not a lawsuit. We are in a deliberate, voluntary, quiet period at Martin's request. We do not know if any settlement progress is being made, so do not assume settlement is underway. Also, the dead man's switch has not been activated, meaning Martin is physically and legally safe.
So with that out of the way, welcome to the debate.
Today, we are tackling a central question that touches, well, every corner of our social safety net, our economy, and a national debt that has now swelled past $39 trillion.
Which is a staggering backdrop for this entire conversation.
It is. So the question is this. Does the government's aggressive new anti-fraud crackdown, spearheaded by Executive Order 14395, the White House Task Force, and the DOJ's new division, does it represent a necessary structural restoration of program integrity?
Or does it risk weaponizing federal oversight, bypassing state nuances, and creating an administrative dragnet that ultimately harms the very vulnerable populations it aims to protect?
Right. And I represent the perspective that this crackdown is not just good, but is a vital and long overdue systemic correction. The evaporation of America's high-trust society means we can no longer rely on the honor system. It necessitates rigorous AI-driven front-end controls and centralized DOJ enforcement to protect taxpayers.
And I come at it from a distinctly different angle. While absolutely no one defends fraud, the sheer velocity, the centralization of power, and the sweeping dragnet tactics of this current crackdown risk paralyzing our legitimate safety nets.
Paralyzing them?
Yes, paralyzing. By coercing state governments with funding threats and incentivizing profit-driven, serial whistleblowers, we are deploying a cure that may very well kill the patient. My concern is that this administrative dragnet is going to come at the direct expense of the actual beneficiaries it is supposedly designed to protect.
Well, let's lay out the groundwork for why this paradigm shift is not just preferred, but, existentially necessary. For decades, the current federal benefit system, whether we are talking about housing, food stamps, Medicare, or disaster relief, was built on an obsolete infrastructure that I can only really describe as an honor system.
I think honor system is a bit reductionist, but go on.
Well, we operated under the assumption that applicants were dealing with the government honestly. You fill out a form, you sign your name under penalty of perjury, and the government cuts a check.
Which worked for a long time for the vast majority of people.
But that era is demonstrably over. The system is now actively exploited, and not just by opportunistic individuals, but by organized criminals, transnational gangs, and highly sophisticated syndicates. We saw the floodgates open post-COVID with that $135 billion stolen.
The COVID relief was definitely a unique pressure cooker, though.
A pressure cooker that exposed the rot. In response,
The creation of the National Fraud Enforcement Division and the White House Task Force, led by Vice President Vance, alongside FTC Chair Andrew Ferguson and DHS advisor Stephen Miller, is a consolidation of resources we desperately needed 10 years ago.
Okay, but you have to look at the collateral damage of that consolidation.
Let me just finish the numbers because the results are already staggering. In just 2 months, this task force exposed $22 billion in fraudulent small business loans and deferred $1.3 billion in fraudulent Medicaid reimbursements in California alone.
Those are big numbers, yes.
The traditional pay and chase model, where the government hands out money blindly and then spends years deploying federal agents trying to claw back pennies from offshore crypto accounts, that model is dead. Implementing prepayment controls, aggressive data sharing, and leveraging the General Services Administration's technological infrastructure is the only logical way to defend a national debt that is north of $39 trillion.
The numbers are undeniably massive. I won't dispute that $135 billion is a catastrophic failure of oversight. But the administration's blunt force approach is deeply alarming when you actually look at the mechanics of how it is being executed on the ground.
Blunt force is what you need for a syndicate.
Not when the syndicate is operating inside a hospital that also serves innocent people. Take the blanket 6-month hold placed on new hospice and home health care enrollments. Yes, freezing the entire system stops potential fraudsters from entering the market,
which is the goal.
but it simultaneously halts legitimate, desperately needed care providers from operating in a nation with a rapidly aging demographic. That is the definition of a cure that actively harms the patient.
I think you're inflating the harm there.
I'm really not. Furthermore, the timelines dictated by Executive Order 1439-5 are dangerously rushed. Agencies had to identify vulnerabilities by April 15th, establish minimum requirements by May 15th, and deliver full implementation plans by June 14th.
They are moving at the speed of the crisis.
When you overhaul the bureaucratic infrastructure of the entire federal safety net in a matter of weeks, you risk catastrophic cash flow disruptions for legitimate hospitals, nonprofits, and state administrators. And perhaps most concerning to me is the explicit push to empower the private sector through expanded False Claims Act bounties.
The whistleblowers.
Right. But when you have groups like the Corporate Whistleblower Center explicitly stating they want to make Fortune 100 company-type profits by hunting for billing discrepancies, you are turning fraud detection into a predatory industry. It invites dragnet litigation that clogs our courts and punishes minor administrative errors rather than actually dismantling the organized crime you're talking about.
You bring up the danger of catching innocent people in a dragnet. But isn't that exactly why they brought in these new structural changes? To shift the focus from chasing people after the fact to building a digital wall at the front door.
A digital wall that locks everyone out.
FTC Chair Andrew Ferguson offered an incredibly potent analogy regarding this exact loss of social trust. He compared our federal benefits programs to a retail hardware store.
Oh, the hardware store analogy, right.
It makes perfect sense. Up until the last decade or so, you could walk into a store, pick up a $200 power drill, and walk to the register. Now you have to hit a call button and wait 15 minutes for an associate to unlock a steel cage. Deodorant is locked behind plastic windows at the pharmacy.
Yeah, and everyone hates it.
But why did they do it? Because organized retail theft forced businesses to adapt. The social trust evaporated, and businesses realized they could no longer operate on an open shelf policy.
Right, but
The federal government is finally having its locked deodorant moment. As Stephen Miller pointed out, the U.S. welfare system previously relied on literally taking people's word for it. Someone could self-certify for food stamps claiming they had 3 hungry children, and the government wouldn't even run a basic database check to verify if those children actually existed.
That is an oversimplification of the application process.
They just assumed you wouldn't lie on a federal form. When you have a zero-trust reality on the ground, where automated bots are flooding state portals with thousands of applications a second, maintaining an honor system architecture is not compassion, it is gross negligence.
Hold on. You cannot compare the federal safety net to a retail hardware store. Locking up deodorant is a minor inconvenience for a consumer. Locking up medical care or freezing disaster relief or halting housing assistance has existential consequences. The stakes are entirely different.
The stakes are exactly why we need to lock it up from criminals.
When the government applies this zero-trust locked cage mentality, it inherently relies on a presumption of guilt until innocence is unequivocally proven. Let's look at how this plays out in reality. Look at the Small Business Administration's recent actions in California.
The $9 billion sweep.
Yes, they froze over 100,000 borrowers in a sweeping $9 billion pandemic fraud crackdown. Concurrently, the task force and the GSA sent letters to 400 businesses, giving them exactly 30 days to prove they have a physical address and are legitimate,
Which they should be able to do.
or face total asset freezes and federal prosecution.
And you think asking a business to prove it physically exists is an unreasonable burden when they are taking taxpayer money?
I think you have to understand how these algorithms actually work. The SBA isn't sending agents to knock on doors.
Right, they are using data matching.
Exactly. They are using data matching algorithms. They cross-reference the business address provided on a loan application with USPS databases, commercial real estate registries, and IP address logs. If a business uses a virtual office or a registered agent service, or if the founder works entirely remotely and uses a P.O. box for privacy, the algorithm flags them as a phantom business.
But they can just reply to the letter and prove they exist.
The AI doesn't understand the nuance of the modern gig economy or fully remote startups. So suddenly a legitimate software consultancy in Silicon Valley has its federal loans frozen, its bank accounts locked, and a 30-day countdown ticking.
30 days is a whole month to send in a lease or utility bill.
When you deploy an automated dragnet of that magnitude, you inevitably trap legitimate, agile, or remote businesses who might not have a traditional brick-and-mortar footprint that neatly matches a rigid federal database. You are disproportionately impacting the very people these programs were designed to help, all in the name of catching the bad actors.
I hear the concern about false positives, I really do. But I have to push back on the scale of the threat, because you are minimizing the caliber of the bad actors we are dealing with.
I'm not minimizing them, I'm saying the net is too wide.
We aren't talking about a single mother making a typo on a form, or a remote startup accidentally triggering a flag. Let's look at the Feeding Our Future scandal in Minnesota. Are you familiar with the mechanics of that?
Yes, the child nutrition program fraud, it was a massive failure.
Exactly. But it wasn't just a few people skimming off the top. This was a $250 million scam orchestrated by a supposed nonprofit.
Right.
During the pandemic, the USDA waived standard site visit requirements to ensure kids could get meals quickly. This group exploited that honor system. They claimed they were serving thousands of meals a day to needy children from locations that turned out to be empty lots or abandoned buildings.
Which is horrific.
They submitted fake invoices, fake attendance rosters, generated by rudimentary software, and funneled millions into luxury cars, commercial real estate, and coastal properties. We're talking about highly coordinated syndicates. In some cases, investigations have alleged funds from these types of scams have been funneled to terror groups abroad.
I acknowledge the severity of the Feeding Our Future case.
When the abuse is this systemic, and when the funds being stolen are massive enough to finance international criminal enterprises, how can a zero-trust model not be justified? The SBA freezing accounts and demanding proof of a physical address isn't a dragnet. It's the bare minimum of due diligence. If you want federal money, you should be able to prove within 30 days that your business actually exists.
It sounds perfectly reasonable in a vacuum to ask a business to prove it exists within 30 days. But in the real administrative world, 30 days to respond to a sprawling federal inquiry can be fatal for a small enterprise, especially when the burden of proof is totally opaque.
It's not opaque. They just need to prove their address.
What documents satisfy the algorithm, though? A utility bill? What if utilities are included in their commercial lease? What if it's a shared workspace? It creates a guilty until proven innocent labyrinth for people who are just trying to run their companies.
They can figure it out. It's better than funding terrorists.
And this leads directly into my deeper concern about the structural realignment we are seeing. It is not just the algorithms, right? It's who is controlling them. We are witnessing an unprecedented centralization of power in Washington. The White House is effectively superseding traditional localized oversight.
It's called federal oversight for federal dollars.
If you look at the recent legal analysis from Pillsbury, they highlight a massive constitutional concern regarding Executive Order 40395. It's the tying of federal funding to states' compliance with federal anti-fraud mandates.
You're talking about the data sharing requirements?
Exactly. The executive order explicitly considers withholding federal funds from jurisdictions that failed to implement the task force's specific data sharing protections. Think about how Medicaid is administered.
Right. It's a joint program.
It is a joint federal-state program. States administer it, the federal government partially funds it. What happens when a state refuses to implement a specific federal data sharing protocol because it directly violates their own state privacy laws?
State laws shouldn't shield fraudsters.
Say it's a state law that protects the medical records of mental health patients from being aggregated into a massive searchable federal database. The federal government under this EO is threatening to pull the plug on vital program funding entirely.
Only if they don't comply with basic fraud measures.
They're essentially weaponizing the purse strings to coerce states into bypassing their own legal frameworks. That is a profound executive overreach. It treats states like branch offices of the White House rather than sovereign entities.
That is an incredibly cynical reading of what they are trying to achieve. What you call executive overreach, I call efficient centralization and cooperative federalism.
Cooperative? They're threatening their funding.
For decades, fraudsters have survived precisely because federal and state databases do not talk to each other. A criminal ring sets up a fake clinic in Nevada, gets shut down, and the next day they open up under a new LLC in Arizona because the systems are completely siloed.
That is a problem, yes.
Let's look at the DOJ's new National Fraud Enforcement Division under Assistant Attorney General Colin McDonald. The structural brilliance here is that it absorbs the tax section, the healthcare fraud unit, and the consumer fraud unit into one cohesive body. It breaks down those bureaucratic silos.
But it concentrates an immense amount of prosecutorial power.
We finally have a unified command structure that can track a criminal who is simultaneously committing tax fraud, Medicare fraud, and consumer wire fraud. And the metrics of success are undeniable. In just the first 50 days of this division's existence, they announced 450 major fraud events.
Right. Well, events being a very broad term.
Events meaning charges, convictions, and sentencing. Tangible legal actions. That includes dismantling a $650 million sober home scheme in Arizona and a $270 million scheme in California.
I read about the Arizona one.
The Arizona case was horrifying. I mean, they were literally recruiting vulnerable individuals suffering from addiction, billing Medicaid for addiction treatment that was never provided, and shuffling patients from house to maximize billing codes.
It's terrible, I agree.
You simply do not achieve the velocity and impact necessary to take down a $650 million syndicate without centralized multi-agency coordination. You need the IRS, the FBI, and HHS all looking at the exact same dashboard.
I don't dispute the numbers on those specific busts. Taking down a predatory sober home scheme is an objective good, but I question the long-term structural cost of how we're getting there. Does moving from a localized U.S. attorney model to a centralized Washington, D.C. National Fraud Detection Center actually improve justice?
How would it not? It's much more efficient.
Because you lose local context. Historically, U.S. attorneys out in the districts, whether in Montana, Florida, or Ohio, they know their jurisdictions.
They also miss a lot of cross-state fraud.
Maybe, but they know the state laws. They understand local healthcare networks, and they can distinguish between malicious intent and bureaucratic incompetence. When you centralize this in DC and rely on AI algorithms analyzing data from thousands of miles away, you lose that context completely.
Data is data. Fraud is fraud.
Not always. A rural hospital in Appalachia struggling with outdated billing software might accidentally double bill Medicare for certain routine procedures. To a local U.S. attorney, they investigate, realize it's a software glitch, and implement a corrective action plan.
Okay.
But to an algorithm in Washington, D.C. flagged for anomalous billing volume, that hospital looks exactly like a criminal syndicate. The DOJ division swoops in, freezes their assets, and suddenly, the only trauma center within 50 miles is forced into bankruptcy because they couldn't make payroll. Context matters in law enforcement, and centralization destroys context.
But that assumes Washington is acting alone in a vacuum, which is fundamentally incorrect. The task force is aggressively partnering with the states, rather than overriding them.
Threatening funding is a funny way of partnering.
Assistant AG McDonald explicitly addressed this localization issue by focusing heavily on the state Medicaid fraud control units. He informally rebranded them as Mafuku, making fraud completely unprofitable units. The DOJ has unlocked a $300 million special attorneys grant program specifically to supercharge these state-level units.
Right, by essentially buying their cooperation.
By funding them adequately, they are paying for states to send their own attorneys to join the federal fraud division and even offering a 20% premium to boost local justice system staffing.
It's federal money strings attached.
They are going to the states and begging them, bring your data, bring your local claims records, bring your local investigators to the table, and we will give you the federal resources to prosecute these cases. This is the exact opposite of an ivory tower Washington takeover.
I disagree.
It is pairing the immense resources, the funding, and the AI capabilities of the federal government with the localized knowledge of the state attorneys general. It ensures that the Appalachian hospital you mentioned has local eyes on the case before the federal hammer comes down.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's a harmonious partnership when the private sector is simultaneously being invited to the table to act as bounty hunters. Which brings us to what I consider the most dystopian element of this entire crackdown.
Dystopian is a strong word.
It's the right word. The privatization of fraud enforcement. The administration is aggressively promoting qui tam lawsuits under the False Claims Act.
Let's define that for a second, just so we're clear on the mechanism for the audience. The False Claims Act, also known as Lincoln's Law from the Civil War era, allows private citizens, whistleblowers, to sue on behalf of the government if they have evidence of fraud.
Right.
And if they win, they get a percentage of the recovered funds.
Exactly. Historically, it was used by an insider, a nurse who saw a doctor forging charts, or a bookkeeper who saw 2 sets of ledgers. But what is happening now is a complete corporatization of the statute.
It's scaling up to meet the threat.
The Corporate Whistleblower Center, an independent organization, has explicitly called to unleash the private sector on the $200 billion in questionable PPP loans. They are openly stating that private enterprises can make Fortune 100 company-type profits by taking the 15% bounties awarded to whistleblowers.
If they do the work, they get paid.
We are incentivizing the creation of a massive, profit-driven cottage industry of bounty hunters. Federal judges are already pushing back, labeling these organizations as serial whistleblowers.
And what is the harm in that, honestly, if they are recovering stolen money?
Because when you corporatize whistleblowing, you change the motive entirely from justice to profit. A tech firm sitting in Silicon Valley isn't going to spend 3 years tracking down a Somali terror cell or a complex offshore syndicate.
Why not?
Because it's hard. They are going to write algorithms that scan public Medicare databases for technical compliance failures. They are looking for the lowest hanging fruit for a quick payout. They will target upcoding errors.
Upcoding is still fraud.
It's often a mistake, like a physician billing for a level 4 complex office visit instead of a level 3 visit, because the guidelines are incredibly opaque. Or they will target minor block grant minutiae at the municipal level.
Well,
They weaponize the False Claims Act to extract settlements from legitimate healthcare providers who are terrified of the treble damages. Paying 3 times the amount of the alleged fraud that the law carries. It shifts the regulatory burden entirely onto the provider, forcing legitimate businesses to spend millions on defensive compliance rather than patient care or business expansion.
I have to interject here. If a private entity has the database capabilities to easily identify fraudulent PPP claims that the federal government missed, shouldn't we align capitalist incentives with taxpayer defense?
Not when it becomes a shakedown.
The national debt is $39 trillion. The traditional regulatory state, even with the new DOJ division, does not have the manpower to review millions of individual small business loans or billions of Medicare claims line by line.
I understand the manpower issue.
If a private tech firm can build a tool that definitively proves a business took millions in PPP loans while being completely ineligible, Maybe they didn't exist before 2020, or they claimed 500 employees but paid zero payroll taxes. Offering them a 15% cut is an absolute bargain for the American taxpayer.
But they aren't just going after clear-cut PPP fraud.
We recover 85% of funds that would otherwise be permanently lost. If the Corporate Whistleblower Center or other entities can build a better mousetrap, we should absolutely pay them for the mice they catch. Why is it inherently wrong to make fraud recovery profitable if the end result is billions returned to the Treasury?
Because again, a private bounty hunter isn't looking at nuance. They don't care why a regional hospital might have miscoded a complex cardiovascular procedure during a staffing shortage.
They shouldn't be miscoding it.
They just see a statutory violation and a 15% bounty. When your primary motive is profit, your priority is volume, not equity. You end up harassing the very institutions that are the backbone of the safety net.
But that defensive compliance you mentioned earlier, the fear of being audited or caught, is exactly what we need on the front end. The era of pay and chase is over, which leads us to the critical role of the General Services Administration, the GSA, under Administrator Edward C. Forst.
The GSA's involvement is definitely a shift.
This is arguably the most structural shift of all. We have historically treated the GSA as the government's landlord and purchasing agent. They manage $126 billion in contracts and 360 million square feet of federal real estate.
Right, they buy the desks and manage the buildings.
Exactly. They buy the government's laptops and manage their office spaces. Bringing them into the White House task force to spearhead anti-fraud tech is a massive paradigm shift.
How so exactly? Beyond just buying new software.
Because they are utilizing their immense procurement and technological expertise to build AI automated systems that act as front-end controls across all agencies. The goal is to verify identity, check tax status, and ensure eligibility before the money ever leaves the agency in the first place.
Which sounds good on paper.
You can't just submit a form and get a check anymore. The GSA's architecture will cross-reference your data instantaneously. And this is where the human cost of fraud becomes undeniable, and why this zero-trust model is a moral imperative.
I'm listening.
Zero Services completely neglected him and billed the taxpayers every single day for care that wasn't happening. The man eventually died alone.
That is absolutely heartbreaking.
In fact, the fraudster was so brazen, they submitted a final reimbursement claim the day before the man passed away. When you don't have front-end controls, you aren't just losing money. You are leaving vulnerable people to die in the hands of criminals who view them strictly as billing codes.
Nobody wants that.
Front-end verification, using GSA's tech to require biometric check-ins or real-time location data for care workers, prevents that specific type of exploitation from lasting years.
That Minnesota case is horrific, and anyone who commits that kind of abuse belongs in federal prison for the rest of their life. I do not dispute that for a second.
Good.
But I have to return to the reality that the blunt tools of this task force are creating their own victims. Let's revisit that 6-month hold on enrollments for new hospice and home health care providers.
Because that sector was riddled with fraud?
The government looks at the data, sees a spike in fraudulent hospice applications, which has been a major issue, especially in places like California and Texas, and their solution is to freeze the entire system.
To clean it up.
While that certainly pauses the fraudsters, it simultaneously denies market entry to legitimate, vital care providers for half a year. We have an aging population. The baby boomers are retiring en masse. 6 months without new capacity in home health care means real patients sitting on wait lists, unable to get end-of-life care.
But if the new capacity is 80% fraudulent, you have to stop it.
It's not 80%, but even if it's high, freezing the whole market is reckless. Furthermore, look at the expedited executive order timelines from April to June.
The speed is necessary.
They are demanding that massive federal agencies like the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services overhaul their most vulnerable transactions, things like redeterminations and new enrollments, in a matter of weeks.
They have the technology to do it now.
Redeterminations are complex. They are the process by which the state verifies if someone is still poor enough to qualify for Medicaid. When you force a bureaucratic machine to move that fast, demanding AI tools and automated controls be spun up overnight, they will inevitably produce massive false positives.
There will be an appeals process.
We've seen this with state-level automated systems before, where a mismatch in database names or a glitch in transferring a file results in thousands of people losing coverage. Legitimate beneficiaries will face catastrophic payment delays, wrongful exclusions, and sudden loss of life-saving benefits simply because the algorithm flagged an anomaly that a human didn't have time to review.
But the alternative is continuing to hemorrhage billions while we take years to slowly perfect a system that fraudsters adapt to in days. We have to prioritize speed.
At the cost of the vulnerable?
The criminals are moving at the speed of light. They're using generative AI to create fake identities and automate mass applications. The government has to move just as fast.
To use a medical analogy of my own, the government is deploying a financial chemotherapy. It is a treatment that is so aggressive, so highly toxic, that it threatens to kill the healthy cells, the legitimate providers, the small businesses, the vulnerable citizens, along with the cancer of the fraudsters.
That's a grim way to look at it.
If you deploy an AI front-end control that mistakenly flags 10% of legitimate food stamp recipients as fraudulent because their income fluctuates seasonally, you haven't just saved the government money.
You've protected the program.
No, you have created a manufactured famine for thousands of families who now have to navigate a labyrinthine federal appeals process just to feed their children. And the government's appeals processes are notoriously understaffed and slow. A 30-day delay in food stamps is a crisis.
I understand the gravity of the chemotherapy analogy, and it's a sobering point. But if the patient, the American economy, and the integrity of the safety net is riddled with stage 4 cancer, aggressive systemic treatment is the only option that prevents total systemic collapse.
But you don't have to kill the patient to save them.
A system that allows $135 billion to walk out the back door in a matter of months is already failing its citizens. We are at a point in this country where the social trust has evaporated. The honor system is dead.
I think it's damaged, not dead.
When billions are actively funneled to transnational criminal networks, the federal government has a profound moral imperative to centralize enforcement, leverage private sector incentives when necessary, and utilize advanced technology to protect the $39 trillion safety net. The National Fraud Enforcement Division and the task force are doing exactly what is required to fortify the foundation of our public programs so they can actually exist for the next generation.
And I will summarize my position by stating that while eliminating fraud is a noble and necessary goal, the execution matters immensely. We cannot govern by panic.
It's not panic, it's action.
A top-down, rushed, dragnet approach that threatens to weaponize state funding, that incentivizes serial bounty hunters to extract profit from our healthcare system, and that freezes legitimate operations is fundamentally reckless. By prioritizing raw enforcement metrics, bragging about 450 events in 50 days, and rapid technological deployment over careful, context-driven oversight, we risk destroying the safety net in our attempt to save it. We cannot abandon the presumption of innocence in administrative law.
Despite our deep philosophical differences on the methodology and whether this is a necessary correction or a dangerous overreach, I think we have reached several vital points of convergence today.
I would agree with that.
We both agree that the sheer scale of the fraud uncovered, whether it's the post-COVID billions or the $22 billion in PPP loans, is entirely unacceptable and poses a severe threat to public trust.
Absolutely unacceptable.
We also agree that the historical pay and chase model is a failed strategy that needs to be replaced. And fundamentally, we both acknowledge that technological modernization, particularly the involvement of agencies like the GSA to implement better data infrastructure, is an absolute necessity moving forward.
I agree completely. The complexity lies in exactly how we balance that program integrity with the fundamental need for accessibility. We have to thread that needle very, very carefully.
Exactly. It leaves us with a profound question to ponder as this new enforcement initiative unfolds over the coming months. Is the loss of the honor system a permanent scar on the American social contract?
It's a heavy question.
It is. And will this unprecedented centralized enforcement apparatus ultimately restore the public's trust in our institutions, or will the sheer force of its dragnet erode that trust even further? We will continue to track the data as the task force implements its mandate.
It's going to be a critical few months ahead for sure.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the mechanisms of our government. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share this content to support rigorous intellectual discourse. We will see you next time.